Unpacking with with Deja Thomas. I also pass the mic to her.
All right. Hi, folks. It's nice to virtually see everyone. Deja Thomas, Program Manager for Care at Work. We are a center house within the UCLA Labor Center. And so on the research side of things, we went through that process of collecting the surveys and analyzing the data. And so we just wanted to take some time to kind of unpack the data, kind of give that high level of like, what did the workers and you all actually share with us? And then also like what that actually translates to in terms of like our own individual working experiences. So if you go to the next slide, as I am going through the data, I would love, like Taylor said, for this to be interactive, as interactive as it can be via Zoom, obviously. So in the chat, feel free to comment anything that surprises you, anything that resonates with you, any questions that come up, just overall gut reactions and answers to some of to some of these questions. And then throughout it, I kind of have my screen set up where I can take a look is when it's a good time for me to pause. And there'll be time at the end for more direct questions as well in relation specifically to the data and how that is maybe similar or different in your own life as well. And so just before getting into all the super specific stuff, I kind of wanted to give a high level overview. So on the next slide, you'll see what the big things that kind of came out of all the data was unaddressed Black jobs crisis. I have it on like the little transition, so you just have to keep clicking, Taylor. And then, so thinking about all the different pieces of crisis that existed before the pandemic, and those, didn't go away. And so that the not addressing it, we saw those same themes and you all shared those same themes. The next big kind of piece that came out that you all shared was around being pushed out and excluded at work. So whether folks who were pushed out, were the first to be let go in 2020, or they were able to keep their jobs, but they still felt extremely excluded at work. And then the third piece was around insufficient systemic support. So the thinking about once people were out of work, once people needed actual support from, the state agencies or local agencies that were supposed to provide them, that was missing and it wasn't there. And then the last piece that really came out and was really strong and clear was around a lack of care infrastructure. And when we say that, it's kind of how folks have described not feeling supported to be both like physically healthy at work as well as like mentally and emotionally healthy, both in and outside of work. So there was no safeguards, no boundaries, no standards to make sure that folks were able to actually, do their jobs, but also take care of themselves and their family and community. So those are like the super high level top 4 things that ultimately like you all shared with us and we just kind of grouped and summarized in the report. So I'll kind of dive deep a little bit into kind of how we saw the Black jobs crisis kind of continue throughout the pandemic, unfortunately. So the Black jobs crisis is generally kind of characterized by disproportionately high levels of unemployment, underemployment, and systemic racism. And so I think we all, for the most part, think unemployment, you're not employed. Underemployment is like the situation where you're having to work in a low wage job or a job that you maybe don't want to or are overqualified for because that's the only work you can find. And that's something that's very common, particularly amongst Black workers because of systemic racism, which I think we all have personal and overall experiences with that. And this is just also a quote from a worker shared as well throughout the survey that I believe we touched on earlier around workers are not just bodies and they are human beings with lives, responsibilities, and other external factors that do not revolve around their job and should be treated as such. And so thinking about that's how we came into the pandemic. this with the Black jobs crisis and Black workers not really feeling like they are being respected as a full human. And so from that, we move on into, okay, what happened more specifically with folks once March 2020 passed and we were living in a global pandemic. And so the next theme is really being pushed out and excluded from work. So about, if you go to the next slide, you'll see about 50% of Black workers surveyed experienced a work disruption, and majority of those folks were still looking for work when we talked to them. So that's meaning, to remind folks, we were surveying from like spring to early summer. So actually, sorry, late spring to early summer. And that's over a year into the pandemic. Folks are lost work and still looking for work. And then the other piece is about 1 in 3 folks reported discrimination on the job, specifically in that about a little over a year window in the pandemic. So we're dealing with the global pandemic, folks are losing or trying to find new work, but still also dealing with discrimination on the job. And thinking about this quote by a young man who shared, you made me feel like you're Black, so you don't matter. So despite everything going on and it being a moment where folks should actually be helping each other even more than they normally would, that didn't change the experiences of folks. You keep on clicking. Yes, and so that is the quote that I just shared. And then the second to last piece related to this, so once folks, whether you were looking for work or you faced discrimination or you were in a situation where you couldn't find work and so you needed to rely on the systems that were built to support workers when they can't find work, the systems that were built to actually support people. And so ultimately, unfortunately, what we found was that you click, like I said, 70% of Black on-site workers surveyed shared concerns around COVID. So there are supposed to be systems to protect workers and to support workers, both specific to keep them safe from COVID, but also to just support them as a whole. And so ultimately, if you click again, there were insufficient systemic support available and accessible. And I think available and accessible is a really, really important thing to remember, in that there were lots of COVID-related and long-standing worker rights and protections available to people. But if folks don't know how to access them, or to access them, it's a whole like rigmarole process to even get the services. It can be really challenging. And ultimately, that support wasn't there. So folks are often dealing with the impacts of the pandemic on their own. And so I did want to highlight in that moment, in that I know I'm talking about data, but the state of California has a website that is specifically looking at that they've compiled all the different like COVID and worker rights related protections for workers into one website called saferatwork.ca.gov. And so it's going to drop it in the chat. So there you can get information and actual real-time updates around the different paid sick leaves available to you as a worker, and the different requirements of your workplace. If you're working in site, there are requirements to keep you safe. And so someone will drop that link in the chat in a second, but I just wanted to flag that. I know we're talking about data, but this is like, everyone's real lives. And then just looking at the lack of care infrastructure was really one of the last pieces that really stood out the most in terms of the data. So like I said, everything I already shared, in addition to their folks not having time off, increased at-home responsibilities, a literal global pandemic, and a long-standing Black jobs crisis. And instead of putting all the stats and all the pieces, this is everyone here's daily lives, whether you remain employed or not. We don't need to see the numbers to feel it again. One thing I did want to flag is how that translates directly into our stress levels. So we asked the question, and I saw a note in the chat asking how the survey was shared. So it's about 2,000 Black workers across LA, San Diego, I see Demetri answered it, Riverside and San Bernardino, and the amount of workers from each county was about proportional to the Black populations. But as you can see, overall, everyone reported pretty high stress levels, of most people reporting 3 or higher. The folks in IE in San Diego actually rated their stress levels, like there was a higher percentage of them at 3 or higher. And then Black women in particular rated their stress levels the highest. And that makes sense when we think about the larger, if we're in a global pandemic, folks are having to go home, having to work from home, or having more at-home responsibilities. There's lots of other, anecdotal and other data that shows that a lot of those at-home responsibilities disproportionately fall on the women in the home, whether it's their mother, daughter, grandmother. And so it translates into stress. And if your work and there's no infrastructure to make sure your work actually protects you and allows you to take care of yourself and others, you're going to be stressed thinking about it. And so particularly, I will plug again the Safer at Work website. There is also family paid sick leave involved, and there are different regulations and all that good stuff, but there is paid leave available for folks to be able to take care of their family members. Not nearly enough, but there's something. So I want to make sure that folks are able to get that information. Yeah, so that's the overview. I think a lot of the things that we learned through the report were not necessarily, we all kind of live this ourselves, our family members, our loved ones, but kind of seeing, nearly 2,000 folks report things on this line is very striking. And I don't want folks to get bogged down into, oh, it's not going well. But thinking about this is something that we can use to move people into urgency and to actually help address these problems. And so I wanted to kind of take a moment, see if there's any other questions or comments in the chat on the next slide, but also to kind of have, if there are any particular questions on the data, I would love for folks to kind of chime in either in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, and we can call out folks to just think about how have you connected to community to help with some of these challenges? So if you've experienced being pushed out or excluded at work, or having trouble navigating the different systems like unemployment or rental assistance, have you connected to community to help with those challenges? Over the last 2 years, have you seen kind of new efforts in your own lives to try to address some of the challenges that you're facing at work? What does it feel like to know that other Black workers are experiencing these things, so you're not alone? And I see one person in the chat, was a survey targeted to those that are entry level to mid-level? The survey was open to anyone who identified as a Black worker, though a lot of the organizations, so the SoCal Black Worker Hub, LA Black Worker Center, IE Black Worker Center, a bunch of Earth Lodge Center for Transformation, their target membership and folks that they outreach to are either low wage or gig sector or essential frontline workers. And there were other orgs that we worked with who focus on women, who focus on youth. So the broad range was anyone who was a Black worker, but the actual, targeting in terms of the partners that we worked with to get the survey out there tend to focus on young workers, low wage workers, and there was young workers and low wage workers were the overall target for some of those groups. But there are lots of combination of folks in the actual data. So you did have folks who reported that they had jobs, they worked from home, all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't a majority. What do you do with any regard to the efforts taken or taken place within specific job industries? So there's a big question. And in terms of efforts to address these challenges, I think there are a lot, and we're actually going to go through some more in detail later today. But I do think overall, a lot of the work of the Black Worker Centers, the LA Inland Empire and San Diego Black Worker Centers, their mission and vision is to directly address these challenges. And so we can, I think we have, if you RSVP'd, we will in the follow-up connect folks to different worker centers if you're interested in getting more directly involved as well. Ooh. I appreciate folks active in the chat, and I know we are on limited time, so I do want to do a time check to the amazing Taylor who's in the background coordinating all of this.
All right. I think Ramona lifted another good point as well. You want to address that, Deja, before moving on?
Yeah. Sorry, my screen. In contrast to the height of pandemic, I've seen many Black women, especially, want the remote work. You just say that's your experience. Yeah, I think overall, that wasn't a direct question we asked. We more so asked, like, are you working remotely or on site? And then from that question, we asked, like, how, what's the safety regulations? But what I would infer is, yeah, I think people would prefer to work remote. All the folks who, I think over half, majority of the folks we surveyed were working on site, which made sense because a lot of the industries were like healthcare or food and grocery or warehousing and transportation. But they, like in the other slide, like 70% or slightly more than 70% of those folks are really concerned about their COVID exposure. So I would assume that in a perfect world, if they could, still pay all their bills and not be exposed to COVID, they would prefer that. But yeah, I think it's a preference, but I think to the point around the unaddressed Black jobs crisis, Black workers going into the pandemic were more likely to be essential workers and frontline workers, which meant many Black workers didn't get the opportunity to work from home from March to April. They never stopped leaving the house for work. But yeah, so just, and I have no worries. We appreciate when folks engage with the data, and I know sometimes some questions that other folks ask are useful for other folks to know as well. So I don't mind at all. In the name of time, I will pass it thinking about to an equitable recovery. Like, what does that actually look like? And that was a direct question that we asked folks, like, what does support look like for you as a Black worker? What do you need from the different folks in your environment? And so I will pass it to Demetria and Elza to walk us through that, what that means.
Awesome. Thank you again, Deja. I will continue as Deja did. As questions come up, please put them in the chat. At many points, we'll stop and hopefully be able to take whatever sort of questions are bubbling up or comments. So please feel free to utilize the chat and engage as we're sharing. My name is Demetria Murphy, and I'm the project consultant at the Southern California Black Worker Hub for Regional Organizing. And I also helped to put together the Essential Stories report. And a lot of what we saw were pretty clear threads of recommendations for what an equitable recovery post-COVID, in this sort of new world we're in looks like. Please go to the next slide, please. And so those recommendations fell again in three categories. So the first being direct worker rights training and workforce development funding to Black workers, right? Understanding that a lot of folks, just as Deja elevated, didn't know what rights that were actually available to them. And a lot of times this information was not information that their employer went into detail about. The second piece, overwhelmingly, folks named to support Black worker wellness, right? You'll see, and we'll get into a couple of quotes, folks named stress, and a lot of these things as barriers to them being successful, right? And so really supporting any sort of equitable recovery needs to support workers holistically. And last but not least, long-term economic support and COVID recovery programming. And you see a breakdown on the side of sort of how these demands fell. Majority of folks named economic support and help with basic needs as the largest area of support. You can go to the next slide. So at the top, there's two quotes highlighted here. One around job readiness, worker rights, discrimination training, and when to report, which a Black woman in her late 40s in the public sector in San Diego named, and a Black man in his mid 30s named better job training and education opportunities for people. And so on the regional level, and one thing I want to note is that these are one, recommendation that we're highlighting, but in the report, you'll notice a lot of more comprehensive list of recommendations there. But at the regional level, really piloting public employment benefit programs to build quality job pathways. And so we know there's a really long legacy of public sector work, right, for Black workers. And so thinking through how do we actually create pathways that funnel Black workers into quality jobs. At the state level, funding Black worker centers to develop and implement Know Your Rights training and resources. And so alongside this report, as outreach was happening with this report, there were simultaneous worker rights and wellness sessions that Yardena Yardena and Earth Lodge led throughout this process. And so really what we learned is that, right, folks really want to know their rights, and Black worker centers are incredibly poised to be able to implement some of this training. And last but not least, funding workforce development training for Black workers. Again, really investing in apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship programs at the state and community level. And go to the next slide. So we know, that there's, I don't think I need to sort of rehash, right, the trauma and the shock and what that does to our bodies and how that impacts us, right, on a daily at work as we move through the world. And so thinking through how do we actually support Black worker wellness in this equitable recovery. So at the regional level, really expanding local human and civil rights offices across Southern California. At the state level, addressing racism as a workplace hazard, right? We understand, safety and occupational hazards, and we know exactly, to call Cal OSHA to report them. But racism does, right? We understand the damage, where we have tons of data and evidence to understand the damage that does to our bodies and to our minds. And so really being able to address that as a workplace hazard. And then at the federal level, being able to, we recommend passing legislation to shorten the work week and actually requiring employers to provide mental health and family community health days to workers. Next slide, please. This is, I think, a really great quote to anchor this economic recovery, right? Financial relief should be available to all Americans, right? There should be an eviction moratorium. There should be financial insurance or assistance, to people who need it, and raising minimum wage. And this is, I think, really colors all of categories of the recommendations around this last category. We can go to the next slide. And so this last category is really around long-term economic support and COVID recovery programming. And so at the regional level, supporting Black workers to navigate, right, the maze of services that we know are available a lot of times, right? This worker here shared, make sure the resources are easily accessible. And we understand Black worker centers are uniquely positioned to be able to help Black workers actually navigate this maze of social services. In the state, really strengthening social safety nets to be responsive to Black workers' immediate needs, right? A lot of folks name that they needed help and they needed support right now, and systems were not responsive enough for them. And then at the federal level, really being able to disperse COVID-19 relief funds, raising minimum wage standards, and then updating Executive Order 11246. And this will create a federal standard of inclusion for Black workers in federally funded projects that actually provide good jobs. And I'm going to pass it over to Elda to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Demetria, and thank you all for joining us tonight again. My name is Elda Solomon. I'm the policy manager with the Southern California Black Worker Hub for regional organizing. And the hub is really only one of the many Black Worker Center affiliated, oriented organizations that operate in Southern California. And we have a number of different initiatives and campaigns, just like this one with Essential Stories, that, really thoughtfully tries to address Black worker issues and understand Black worker issues, and listen to what Black workers are saying in Southern California, so that I can best inform our work for, in the kind of work that we take on to try to advance Black worker needs and initiatives, and the things that will better our communities. And for us right now, what toward an equitable recovery is, as Demetria mentioned, because of all this really great data that we have gleaned and synthesized and gotten to learn a lot from Black workers on, we've taken on what we call Build Black Better for All campaign, which is a campaign that that is not new to the hub. It's a new initiative, but it's a kind of an older problem with amending Executive Order 11246. And 11246 is a federal level executive order issued in the 60s by President Lyndon B. Johnson during the Civil Rights era. And it's the short of it is that it's an executive order that prohibits federal contractors, those who take on contracts with the federal government, from discriminating against workers on race, class, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and a number of other identity things. So 11246 is really essential in keeping federal contractors upholding equal opportunity standards and making sure that those who are employed on federal contracts do not face discrimination. And unfortunately, we know that Black workers and many other workers do face discrimination in a variety of workplace settings, including on federal contracts like in construction, in infrastructure, building trades, and lots of other things that federal contracts sort of encompass. So amending 11246 will then create a federal and California-wide standard for the inclusion of Black workers in federally funded projects. As it stands now, the executive order only mandates that federal contractors contract or employ minority workers, but it doesn't specify workers based on race. It just has one huge minority number. So we're hoping to amend 11246 so that it will represent Black workers and make it so that there is a standard for including Black workers on these federal contracts. We think this is a really important campaign in this time, namely because of the large federal infrastructure bill that is coming down and was passed in November of last year, and trillions of dollars coming down to the state level to improve waterways, roads, bridges, airports, lead piping, broadband, and a number of really, really important and very sorely needed issues that need to be addressed across the country. And California is poised to receive one of the biggest investments as well. So we're really excited to launch this campaign and make sure that when those federal dollars come to the state level, that Black workers are in the right position and right place and are trained and skilled to get to take on those really important jobs that really historically have led Black workers to gainful employment, to middle-class access, and to a really fruitful life through sustainable and quality employment. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you all on this Build Back Better campaign, Build Black Better for All campaign, and thinking through how these recommendations can help you, whether that be because you yourself are a building tradesperson or involved in the infrastructure sector, or involved on a federal contract, or someone you know, or those in your community. How do these recommendations resonate with you in the current moment? Like I said, it's such a huge moment with the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better plan from President Biden's office, that we're really trying to position Black workers to be in the best place to get to participate in this really big once in a generation investment. And what hopes do you have for an equitable recovery? We've seen it time and time again. We've seen it in the New Deal, in the New Deal, and we've seen it in the Great Recession, that Black workers historically, or Black communities, have the hardest time with recovery. And that's because they don't have the access to the essential kinds of resources that other populations might. So what are your hopes for an equitable, what are your hopes for an equitable recovery? And we'd love to hear from you in the chat. I'm seeing some things in the chat. Christy, thank you. I love how our excellence propels to keep going. I agree, couldn't agree more. and Ramona, are the topics presented what we are looking to implement or what has actually been implemented so far? These are things that we are hoping to implement at the state and federal level. The federal level executive order is 11246, and we're hoping to implement this at the state level with various resolutions in Los Angeles, Inglewood, San Diego, IE, and Sacramento, and other places all over California, so that federal contractors must have numbers for Black workers on these federal contracts, so that Black workers can be employed just fairly and equitably along with other workers.
And I will lift up the totality of recommendations were recommendations from workers from the survey. So we asked a question asking folks, what would an equitable recovery look like? And these recommendations are coming from what folks named in the survey.
I think Christy brought up a really good point in the chat. Eldon and Demetria, if you guys want to discuss that.
Yeah. So Christy, I think the biggest part of equitable recovery is education and reach. Conversations like this creates access to restructuring how we view ourselves as a part of the ecosystem of impact. Absolutely, absolutely. Which is, I couldn't agree with you more, Christy. And one of the categories of recommendations is around worker training, right? And I think training in all respects, right? Thinking through, right, like what are our rights, training around those pieces, training around upskilling, right? Thinking through, okay, if I want a job in the water sector, what is the training I might need to be able to have that job in the water sector, right? And I know that's one campaign that the Inland Empire Black Worker Center is working on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Demetria. And yeah, and that education and reach is and what's really a huge part of it is just having the access to get to participate fully in these kinds of jobs and in this industry that's rapidly growing in tech and green spaces and a lot of different ways that infrastructure is growing, not only in the kind of traditional ways that we've seen it in the past. And why we think Build Black Better is so important is because we're hoping to implement a state level initiative and resolution that will make it so that Black workers, have access to education, like you mentioned, through apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship, and then we'll also have equitable access to really gainful employment. So yeah, thank you for that, Christy.
Yeah, I know that we're short on time, but I will address really quick your piece, Yardina, and then kick it over to you. I definitely think that there's a huge piece there, particularly with what Deja spoke about around the lack of care infrastructure, and thinking through one of our recommendations was around, right, increasing paid family leave, right, access to childcare, these things that we understand are essential parts of our economy that often we know, right, people are coming out of pocket just to be able to support. So absolutely. And I will move us along to the next side. Absolutely, yes, people should be paid for their time. I say that any apprenticeship or training program should be paid. Absolutely. All right, Taylor, we can move to the next slide and I will push us over to talking more about worker wellness.
Thank you so much, Demetria. My name is Yardina Aaron. I'm Managing Director of the Earthlaw Center for Transformation, where we center nature-based wellness and healing techniques that stem from the Black Southern experience, reclaiming the power of our closeness with nature that we developed during that time to heal us, aid us, and to help us grow. And as part of our contribution to this project is taking back wellness on the job, healing on the job, and making sure that going to work doesn't have to stress you out to death. And invoking and making sure that everyone knows their rights and are able to participate in the mediation that different agencies provide, whether it's the Labor Commissioner's Office, the Department of Labor. There are systems that are in place that we can access, many of which were created by our hand in the 60s to help protect our rights, so reclaiming our place there as well. Next slide, please. before I hop into this, I want to give a big thank you to Yetunde, who's on the call. Even though she wasn't able to do tonight's presentation, some of you may have received a call from her outreaching about this event, and she was the one who orchestrated, designed, and wrote this particular guide that we're going to share highlights from. So thank you to her again. 15 wellness practices to help cope with job stress. Now, we saw the off the chart barometer that Deja showed, that stress on the job was one of the number one things mentioned by 2,000 Black workers here in Southern California. How do we mitigate this stress? What's in our control? What is not in our control? And how can we come to a deeper level of wholeness on the workplace? We all know on this call that work is one of the major sources of trauma of Black people. Whether you experience racism at work, whether you experience bias at work, whether you experience being skipped over for a promotion at work, whether you experience not having the opportunity to learn another language in order to deepen your enrichment skills at work, whether your pension is challenged at work. Stressors come from all types of areas for Black people. And here are some tips. Here are some ways to help you cope with this. Now, because of the time, please download the guide and take your time with it. I don't want to necessarily lose people who have that hard stop at 6:30. So I'm going to do some overall broad strokes. Meditation. We can meditate at any time. One of the things that we like to invite people to do is to take a moment to meditate before you go to work. A lot of times is when we experience a stressor at the workplace that we need to take that moment. We need to step outside. We need to talk to a coworker. We can get grounded before we even walk in and have a different presence, whether it's with ourselves, with our coworkers, or with those who may have some influence and power over us, also known as our bosses. Bring plants and nature into the workplace. Do you have some control over your space? The literature is extensive at this point about whether it be the calming effect that plants and flowers have on us. Bring it to work. Don't leave it in your garden. Bring that potted plant and sit it right there on your desk, because it has the same effect often that some of our pets do. Bring in your favorite plant. One of our colleagues here at the Earth Lodge says, who is your plant ally? Find out what that plant is and bring it to work with you as well. Another big piece we want to talk about is buddying up. Now, we kind of all know who that coworker is or isn't that we can talk to about certain things that we're experiencing. You can deepen that relationship by talking about things that matter. What are your stresses? Documenting them in a worker rights and wellness journal. That's key. We're going to begin to produce those, and some agencies already have those, and they may already exist with some of our worker-centered partners, where yourself, your coworker ally, will be able to sit down and jot down a couple notes. How was the day? Were there any things that were suspect that happened through the day? Name the time, name the person, because this is the documentation. These are the notes that you would bring to the worker center, that you would bring to the agency, that you would bring to a site meeting, especially if you have a union on site, that you would bring to HR to be able to document your experience. Another group of our recommendations center around not just bringing in plant allies, but in their various forms. If you've heard or have used a spritzer, please document that in the chat. An aromatherapy spritzer, if you use essential oils, if you get that certain incense from someone who may be selling incense in your neighborhood and you have that favorite smell, that aromatherapy is often bringing a certain level of relaxation, calm, and having an anti-stress effect. Now, some of us can burn things like incense in our workplace, some of us cannot. Rose and lavender. But spritzers, you can take anywhere. If something's not right, or if something happens that's suspect, you can just spray that spritzer around you, and it can help invoke a sense of peace on the spot. that you can take with you no matter what's happening in your workplace. Next slide, please. As we go to the next slide, we also talk about making sure that your inner health is up to par. Are you taking your vitamins? What supplements do you need? We know that a lot of people, especially if you're working from home or you're sheltering in place, or if some of the recommendations had come down of the desire to work from home more, you need to still get vitamin D. In our community, we know that vitamin D is one of the most, we have a lot of deficiencies in that area. So make sure that that regime is also up to par. Also, seek counseling should you need it. Stay positive. There was a time where I believe there was a stigma around getting mental assistance, seeing someone, talking it out. Let that not be your case, especially for those who may have health plans that offer that. Drink more water, get moving. Even if you have to exercise in place, do some stretches. All of this contributes to the overall body mind balance and helps to reduce stress at the workplace. Now, as I wrap this up, at the end of the guide, you're going to see some resources around Know Your Rights, because we believe that we have responsibility as ourselves, and agency has responsibility to make sure that our rights are protected in the workplace. All of the things that Elda and Demetria were mentioning. Here are some of them. Use this as a reference guide. Links to Cal OSHA, links to the Labor Commissioner's office. If you experience the retaliation, now you have a link of who to call. Use the link that was shared earlier that Deja shared around Safer California around COVID-19. Exercise your supplemental sick leave. You have worker and job protection. Okay? I'm going to put our our contact info is actually a part of this guide, and we're so blessed to be a part of this project. And we also believe that racism is a public health crisis. With this much stress being mentioned by Black people on the job, it's time for us to do something about it and access the training and access the policy and wellness dollars that are due our community as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I saw some of you putting if you like had um essential oils and things like that that you use in your daily life. Someone said lavender, rose and lavender spritzers. But if there's any other um, workplace stress management techniques that you use, or if you practice any of the techniques that were mentioned, appreciate you dropping them in the chat, and then we can kind of discuss them. Okay, Christy says, use plants, crystals, essential oils, and music. Definitely encourage that. Essential oils are a big one for me as well. A quick lap around my building in between meetings. That definitely helps to clear the mind a little bit. Oh, some good app recommendations: the Calm app, the Shine app. Oh, naps for sure. Yeah, anytime you can get a chance to take a nap is really important. Get some sun and vitamin D. Yes, vitamin D is super important. Yardina had so that can definitely up, your happy hormones and those types of things. So lots of good app recommendations. The Shine app. Chrissy said that has so many resources for all Black women. That's super important. It is Women's History Month, so we want to highlight that app. A Liberate app. Ujjayi Breath. Okay, I haven't heard that one. That one sounds amazing. And Himalayan Salt Lamp and Sunray Lamp. Oh, Iatunde brought up a good point as well. Um, if anyone wants to take a shot at this question, she uplifted the question, wondering if anyone is experiencing backlash for continuing to wear their mask at work. If maybe Deja, Demetra, and Elda, you want to touch on what to do in that situation if you have experienced that, or just any updates on rules and regulations as it comes to COVID protection and PPE.
Sorry, it took me a second to find my unmute button. Yeah, I haven't heard anyone necessarily experiencing backlash for continuing to wear their mask because the regulations have changed. Like they can't be forced not to or not to. But I will say all workplaces are supposed to have a COVID safety plan. And so as a part of that plan is how you're keeping your workers safe. And so that's still supposed to be happening. So if that is happening, I would include that in some questions for the employer, but also if there are other more specific questions and they're experiencing retaliation, definitely look at the links dropped in the chat and in the guide, as well as, once again, this space and these folks on this call are also a resource. So however, you got the RSVP link to this event. If there are anything that comes up and you're not sure where to go, definitely reach back out to whoever texted or email you, and we'll make sure you get the right support. But yeah, like Yadina said, employers, masking is now at their discretion. So there's a little bit less clarity on like the exact path. But we can support, and also the links can support as well.
Yes. Just a reminder as well, everyone who RSVP'd through the Action Network link will be getting a follow-up email with all the resources that we shared in this Zoom. So if you didn't get a chance to save them, don't freak out. We'll send them all out to you. All right, well, thank you everyone for dropping all their wellness resources and those types of things. Definitely continue practicing those. There's a lot of stress that we can feel from work. Oh, and thank you, Christy, for the link as well. Definitely be getting a sunray lamp. That's a great recommendation. All right, Yardina, if you wanna, I'll be passing the mic to Yardina so she can kind of ground us again and close out this event.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Now I'd like to do a check-in. I know that my Zoom froze out while we were getting grounded in the beginning. How are we now? If you had to give a percentage of when you measure from the beginning after hearing the presentation and some of the information to now, what percentage of your body are you in? Would you say that you feel 50% here, 60%, 40%? If we could drop that in the chat to see how we stayed grounded and to measure where we need to go, it'll give us a sense of how this information empowered us to get more in our bodies, more in our community, and more into our future. So as we pay attention to our scalp and our forehead and our eyes and our ears and our nose and our lip and our neck and our shoulders and our back and our stomach and our intestines and our anus and our buttocks and our thighs and our elbows and our knees, our shins, our calves, our fingers, our toes, the top of our feet, the bottom of our feet, our mind and our brain, the blood that's circulating through us, giving us life force, this total package that we take to work and that we bring home thereafter. Remembering the quote from the sister earlier in the presentation that we're not just bodies, we're much more. We're not just workers, we're much more. We would like for you to leave this presentation feeling more grounded, feeling more hopeful, feeling even more entrenched that there's a voice, making sure that Build Black Better changes the story for ourselves, for our kinfolk, for our families, and our communities. Give me a thumbs up if you feel a little bit more grounded or a lot of bit more grounded now than you did from when we first began our conversation and our time together this evening.
All right.
Ashe and give thanks.
Thank
Okay, I'll
you so
pass
much.
it back.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Ardina, for that amazing grounding exercise. I know we went through um, some content that might be emotional, and so it's good for us to ground ourselves and reclaim our peace. All right. So moving forward, thank you all for joining us today. We had a great discussion. Thank you all for engaging in the chat and just helping us unpack all this data. If you would like to stay updated with us, you can follow us on social media at SoCal Black Worker Hub, SoCal BW Hub. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter. And then this is also our website. On all these social media platforms, we will be kind of breaking down the campaign that Elda and Demetria touched on, the Build Black Better for All, and we'll have some events following that. But like I said, I'll be sending out all the links, the important links that were sent out during this meeting today, so you can all have those resources. And that will also include my email. So if you have any follow-up questions or things like that, just go ahead and respond to that email, and I can get you connected with whatever you need. So thank you all so much for joining us today. All right.
Us to spark conversation, verbal elation, stimulation, share our situation, temptation, education,